We've all seen a lot of stories lately about statues coming down. Let's not honor this founding father or that war hero because he had slaves, or he had a racist past in other ways, or he's just a straight up Confederate soldier. And I happen to agree with the sentiments of the protesters. No one's rewriting history, but there's no reason to honor or praise people who have these glaring problems in their past. Let them stay in the history books and museums and nowhere else. But that conversation led the creationists at Answers in Genesis, the Ark Encounter people, to ask a question literally no one was asking. Should we cancel Charles Darwin? Because to them, he's super racist. And therefore, evolution is not just wrong, but wrong and evil. Let's cancel evolution. Checkmate, atheists. Here's a brief glimpse at their conversation. They're talking on their twice-a-week YouTube show about an article on a conservative website suggesting that Darwin be canceled.
And he was talking about how people are all upset about these Confederate statues and things like that, but what about Charles Darwin? Because he was extremely racist, and yet he's celebrated, he's taught in public schools across the nation, in colleges across the nation, and yet he was horribly racist. So why are we not upset about Darwin and wanting to cancel Darwin?
I'll tell you what I'm upset about, Avery. I've been saying this for a long time.
You've been saying it for a very long time.
And I have a number of posts on this.
Did you hear what they said about him? Darwin is celebrated. He's in the textbooks. They teach him in public schools. Just proves to you they have no idea what goes on in public schools. But let's play devil's advocate for a moment and talk about what they're so upset about before we talk about why they're wrong. Why do people like them think Darwin is racist? They didn't go in depth in their conversation because depth to them would be 0.5 millimeter. That's a creationist joke. First, they'll point to the language in Darwin's writings. He referred to Aboriginal people as savages. He really did think white Europeans were superior to every other group of people, especially those of color. Today, yeah, we can say that's totally racist. Darwin is the uncle who would have ruined your Thanksgiving dinner. And I don't think we're excusing it when we also say that's basically the way a lot of people in his upper class, Victorian, imperialist English community talked and thought at the time. So if everyone was a racist, how racist was he? Well, by comparison, not as much. Darwin was against slavery, wanted it abolished. He's kind of like Mitt Romney. Romney is one of the more sane Republicans in the sense that he's the only Republican senator who voted to impeach Donald Trump. But he's still a Republican, and you should never vote for him because his ideas are almost always horrible. But at the same time, have you seen the rest of his party? I mean, given the alternative, I guess I wish they were Republicans like Romney, but I would prefer not having them at all. What were we talking about again? Darwin's racist. So you could say Darwin was a lot less racist in a community full of raging racists. He's still a Republican, but he's not the worst Republican. So, yay? Question mark? Does any of this make sense anymore? Ken Ham also wrote this on his website about why Darwin's writing inspired racism. Darwin wasn't the first to propose biological arguments for racism, but his works fueled the most ugly and deadly racism. Even evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould wrote, "Biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1859, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory." Ham purposely didn't share the rest of that passage, because what Gould was saying was that racism was always around, but once evolution became popular, racists had a new tool to play with. Not because science proved they were right, but because it opened the door for more horrible people to point to science to justify their bigotry. They were like the atheist YouTubers of their time. It's kind of like when 5G technology was introduced, it increased by orders of magnitude the amount of conspiracy theories pointing to 5G technology as the cause. It doesn't mean there's a problem with the technology, it means there's a problem with people. One last thing about Darwin's language. Even in his book, The Descent of Man, which he published later in his life, and where he really sprinkled in that language about savages and people who were not civilized, he also said the distinctions between people of different races was minimal and superficial, and that the gradient of skin color really meant race was more of a social construct than anything meaningful. That's not to excuse the language, but let's put it in some context. Second reason they think Darwin is a racist, creationists will point to the subtitle of his book on the origin of species, The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. But this one is just stupid. He's not saying favored races like white people rule. He's using the word race as a synonym for variety. Species or individuals with the right adaptations will survive. They're favored, while the ones that can't or don't adapt will die out. In the book, he literally uses the phrase, the several races, for instance, of the cabbage, because there are different types of cabbage, not because green cabbage is superior to purple cabbage. Third, they will point to the way evolution, or should I say evolution, has been used in ways that have nothing to do with the development of species. Some people have treated survival of the fittest, a phrase Darwin never said, as a way to justify white nationalism. Why help shithole countries that are struggling? Some people have promoted eugenics, suggesting there are certain traits we want to preserve, and they just happen to coincide with the people making the decisions. But again, these things have nothing to do with Darwin or his theory. There are other things science deniers may point to, but those are the big reasons they say Darwin is racist, or Darwinism promotes racism. The weird thing is, if anything, you could argue evolution actually promotes the opposite of racism. The idea that we are all interconnected, that we all share the same ancestors if you go back far enough, the idea that we're all basically the same regardless of skin color, that's amazing. Those are reasons not to be racist. If people thought a long time ago that black and brown and white people were totally different and created a hierarchy from that, well, guess what? Turns out we're practically genetic clones. So when creationists, or Christians in general, say Darwin was racist, it kind of depends what we're talking about, and it mostly doesn't matter. Because if you're lucky enough to learn evolution in high school or college, and you dive deep into it, not just a definition or two, then you know that literally no teacher dwells on the life of Darwin. You learn some basic things, and that's it. Something about a trip to the Galapagos and the name of his ship. No one's quizzing you on the personal biography of Darwin. His personal beliefs, his background, it's mostly irrelevant. The reason he gets attention is because he's the guy whose explanation of evolution changed the way we talk about where we came from. It offered a clear account of our history that had nothing to do with the book of Genesis. He wasn't even the first guy to come up with the idea. He didn't necessarily invent evolution, but he wrote it up in a way that connected different strands of thought that existed at the time. As a professor once said, who discovered evolution? Charles Darwin, in a sense, but he was the world's 70th evolutionist. Over time, other scientists refined those views, and our understanding of evolution today is so much more detailed and fascinating than even Darwin would have dreamed possible. That's because in the 160 years since his book came out, we've discovered so many more mountains of evidence supporting Darwin's basic ideas. I mean, we didn't really even know how DNA worked and how evolution could proceed until a century after his book came out. The point is, Darwin's life story doesn't really matter. There are monuments to him in some places, and he used to be on the British 10-pound note, but not because of what he believed. It's about what he discovered, or at least popularized. His theory laid the foundation for our understanding of science. And honestly, I don't care about the monuments. Take them down. Jane Austen replaced him on the money, and that's fine. Won't change the fact that his fundamental ideas about evolution were right. We could discover tomorrow that he secretly funded the founding of the KKK, and the proper reaction would be, "Oh, that's a shame. Why'd you do that, Chuck?" But evolution would still be true. So let's go back to that article those creationists were talking about. It was a piece by Peter Heck for the conservative outlet Discern, in which he wrote, "Even by the most generous of measures, the intellectual and philosophical heritage of Charles Darwin is one of the most hideously racist legacies one can fathom. And yet, his inherently racist dogma is not only presented in public schools across America, it is state and federal policy that every student in America demonstrate proficiency in understanding and applying his dangerous ideology." Applying his dangerous ideology, as if a high schooler can magically control evolution. It's just a dumb passage. Darwin's inherently racist dogma is not taught in public schools. Imagine how deluded you have to be to think teachers spend so much time on evolution that they have extra time to talk about racism. No, they don't, even if they wanted to. And also, the ideology isn't inherently anything. It's not racist, it's science. People who use evolution to justify their other beliefs might be racist, but the evidence is in on the underlying thesis. Even if Darwin got canceled, evolution would not be. It's not tied to him. You can't discredit science by pointing to a scientist's flaws. It's not a Harry Potter book. And if you think an idea ought to be tossed out just because some people have used it in ways that we should all frown upon, wait till you learn about religion. I can't believe the people who constantly depict Jesus as white, even though he would have lived in the Middle East, are the ones who never stop telling us Darwin promoted white supremacy. The beauty of evolution, like any subject in science, is that we have a way to test it. The theory is constantly confirmed and refined with new evidence. It could also be overturned with new evidence. But when it comes to evolution, no one's found it yet. The creationists would be far better off spending $100 million looking for fossil rabbits in the Precambrian, or any other kind of evidence that refutes evolution, and getting it peer-reviewed and published, than on building a replica of Noah's Ark. That's a lie. They would still be wasting money because they still won't find the fossils. But while we're on the subject, Ken Ham is the last person who should be accusing other people of dabbling in racism. In 2014, Ham announced a new skeleton of an allosaur in the Creation Museum, allegedly worth $1.5 million. Who donated it? A foundation run by Michael Peroutka, a former board member of the League of the South, a white supremacist group that has been declared a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center, whatever that's worth to you. You can read more about that in the description. Also, if you ever visit Ark Encounter, the back of their tickets include an ad for Bob Jones University, which is most famous for banning black students until 1971, banning students in interracial marriages for even longer, and then instituting a ban on interracial dating on campus. You know when they finally rescinded that interracial dating rule? 1975? 1980? No, in the year 2000. And you know what Ken Ham didn't mention in that video or article? The curse of Ham. No relation, but Google it. Racists can use anything to justify racism, even Kenny's favorite book of the Bible. My point is not that Ham is racist. I genuinely do not think he is. But if he's trying to connect Darwin to racism as if his ideas are inherently flawed, I'm just saying it's not hard to play that game with him either. Look, this idea of turning on old scientists or the founding fathers or Christopher Columbus isn't new, but let me leave you with this. If you burned all traces of Darwin and his books and every science textbook about evolution, and if you erased everyone's memory so no one knew anything about our origins, and you did the same thing regarding the Bible, and all of us had to start from scratch, I promise you this, the books about evolution would eventually contain the same information, because the principles themselves were just waiting to be discovered and explained. You don't need Darwin to make sense of evolution. The Bible, on the other hand, would look completely different, because that's what happens with a work of fiction.